kitchen was a scene of flowery, though alienless chaos when Genie and the Big Chill entered to the sound of circling helicopters. Though Ginny still clung to faint hope the helicopters weren't filled with men in black and would go somewhere else, she didn't have to see one land to know she'd been clinging to broken straws. And apparently bad analogies. If Dex and her mom had hoped to blow smoke up their black pants, they'd made pretty good progress. There was a huge blob of white dough in the middle of the table, indicating cookies in progress. Isaac had a smaller, flattened blob that he was attacking with a snowman cookie cutter. Daphne, flowered to her elbows and sporting a Santa hat and a pretend smile, was whacking inexpertly at it with a rolling pin. The Big Chill stretched a hand toward a wayward clump. "I wouldn't," Dex said, his lips twitching. Based on the amount of time they'd had to mix the blob up, Ginny figured it was just flour and water. Dex's gaze tracked between them, possibly noting the tension indicating unresolved issues. Or not. The guys in her books noticed stuff like that, but that might be wishful writing with no basis in reality. Christmas music channeled into the room from an old-style boombox on the counter, and there was even a half-sliced fruit cake on a wooden cutting board. Bet no one would try a taste of that. It looked authentic enough to be scary, and bore a remarkable resemblance to the one they hadn't eaten last year. If the Big Chill or the Men in Black didn't look below the surface, they'd see a scene of ordinary Christmas activity. Her nerves stretched taut. She decided she couldn't wait for trouble to come to them. And honestly, wouldn't they be curious? Sounded like the end of the world out there. So she went to the door and yanked it open, letting in a blast of cold and noise. The man standing there with a half-raised fist wasn't wearing black, at least not where it could be seen. He'd gone woolly mammoth with his outerwear, even had a face mask and goggles. It was kind of sad. Yes, it was cold, but this wasn't the North Pole. Maybe he'd thought that's where they were going and been hoping for Santa too. There was an idea for a book. The Men in Black versus Santa. As if he realized he was overdressed for the cold, he lifted mask and goggles, revealing a stereotypical Fed face, one straight out of the movies, clean-cut and crisp. Statistically, they couldn't all be that way. Maybe the guys in black got first pick or something. He held a weapon, but it was pointed down. More figures leaped off the helicopter in the clearing, its rotating blades kicking up its own small blizzard of snow. As soon as it disgorged its passengers, it lifted off, allowing another one to take its shot at the spot. The rotating blades moved enough snow to almost drill down to dirt. She had to assume there were more choppers in the front. The racket was incredible with the door open. Like swift ants, they flowed in either direction, clearly intent on surrounding the cabin. Talk about overkai. She cut off the word in her head. But the sight of so many armed men, well, it didn't matter if she didn't think it. The risk was there. Genie had to fight not to let her gaze look up, like she could see through the porch roof to the rooftop. Fear kept her from moving to look. She for sure didn't want to get them interested in what may or may not be up there. So she looked the guy in the eyes and slowly raised her hands about shoulder height, but letting her expression speak incredulous volumes. A tinge of red crept up his cheeks. Interesting that she could make a man in black blush. That would never have happened in the movies. She leaned out just a bit and glanced around. "Is something wrong?" She had to shout to be heard. Okay, not her brightest comment ever. She could do better when she had time to edit. "Are you all right?" he managed to shout without looking like he was. Genie let her brows rise. "I was." She looked past him again, then said, "What's going on?" The question seemed logical, normal. Did she know what that was anymore? "There's been a prison break." "Prison?" She didn't have to fake that shock. "What prison?" The man in fur looked taken aback. "Rawlings is what?" She half looked back at Dex. "Over 200 miles from here, isn't it?" "Closer to 250. he agreed, joining her in the doorway. The racket began to ease. Apparently, all the choppers had done their thing and retreated to a circling vulture's position. Now the Christmas music could be heard again, boosting their festive creds, or so she hoped. Behind her, Desi sang softly along as she cut cookies out of the somewhat flattened blob. Daphne lifted her rolling pin. A clump of dough still stuck to it. She started pounding it against the wood table. The guy blinked a couple of times, or possibly he winced as he took in the scene, then finished his survey with Dex's uniform. The rolled-up sleeves looked normal and logical, given the cookie-making going on. Dex had added some flowery touches to his hands and hair. "How long have you been here?" Dex's brows shot up, but he answered with unruffled calm. "Since mid-afternoon yesterday. Why?" Man in fur blinked some more. "It was actually a prison plane. It went down, not far from here, we think." He straightened as if someone had barked at him. "We need to search this structure. All structures, actually." Dex shrugged and stepped back, his body nudging Gini out of the way. "Sure, come on in." Gini wasn't sure what he knew that she didn't, that made him look so unworried. She just hoped he knew what he was doing with what he knew that she didn't, and that what he knew that she didn't was true, because she'd left at least 2 aliens back there. "Is there anyone else in the house?" the guy asked as a group of men formed a line behind him, clearly intending to be part of the search party. This did not appear to deplete the numbers surrounding the house all that much. "As far as I know, we're all right here," Dex said. "I can show you around." The man held up his hand. "No offense, but no." "None taken," Dex said easily, turning back to the table. "What was it you wanted me to find for you, Desi?" "The sprinkles, dear," her mom said placidly, "and I think there are some more cookie cutters in that drawer there." She pointed to a drawer, and Dex headed toward it. The man in fur's gaze lighted on the big chill. No surprise his shoulders straightened some, as if he'd come to attention. The big chill had done more to erase slouching than the military. The man in fur cleared his throat. "We should be out of your way soon, sir." After a long, unnerving pause, the big chill let his chin dip a millimeter or so. Man in fur ran a finger around the neck of his furry coat. Gini was pretty sure that didn't help. "The rest of the house is that way." Gini indicated the opening. "Oh, except for a bathroom over there." The man in fur blinked, nodded, then, for some reason, looked at Isaac, who had looked up from his labors, giving him that look that Gini found so unsettling. His snowman cookie appeared to have suffered some kind of mortal wound. "Can I have a ride in your helicopter?" It would have been an uncomfortable silence version 3.4, but for the music and stamp of booted feet as the men spread through the cabin. Conscious of the big chill's gaze on her, Ginny tried to look curious instead of on the verge of mind-melting panic. It wasn't just Big Chill looking at her either. She felt the concentrated attention of Dex and Desi. Did they think she was the weak link in a room that contained Daphne? She'd have been offended, but there was no room left for any more emotions. Where were the rest of the aliens? What about their flying saucer up on the rooftop? Oh, how she wanted to ask. But of course, even if the men in black weren't in the room with them, that didn't mean they hadn't left someone or something lurking out in the hall in hopes she'd be just that clueless, or dropped a bug on their way by. She glanced around but didn't see anything obvious, because it would be. Dough. So much depended on what the men in black knew, or thought they knew, and the measures the aliens had taken to protect themselves. Now, when she couldn't ask, she wondered why their mothership had a cloak, but not the flying saucer up on the housetop. Could their capabilities be connected like the ships in Independence Day? It was an unfortunate connection to make, because then she wondered if she'd picked the right side. What if she was helping to prepare the way for their whole world to be conquered? Her gaze collided with Dex's, and his lips twitched, as if he knew what she was thinking. Easy for him to be chill when he was packing heat. Only they didn't call it that anymore, did they? Floorboards creaked as the search moved upstairs. She stiffened as she remembered the magic rock presents by their beds. Had anyone thought to remove those? She knew the old cabin's creak points well enough to know exactly where they were. If she hadn't been stiff with fear, she'd have been upset with the idea that her personal space was being searched. She heard the distinctive squeak of the attic steps being pulled down, and much of the stamping boot sounds moved up and away. Almost imperceptibly, she relaxed. There was nothing in the attic for them to find, and if they'd found something, wouldn't someone come? "Ma'am?" Gini turned toward the opening. The man looked at her, not her mom, which should have been a relief, but wasn't. She wasn't that old. And no, it wasn't situation appropriate to be annoyed at being Ma'am D, but why be appropriate now? The man, a different man in fur than the first one at the door, looked directly at her. Gini fought back the longing to flee. She arched her brows in what she hoped was an unworried question. She didn't speak because she wasn't sure she could. It felt like multiple squeaks were stuck in her throat, with a scream or two behind them. "Could you come into the other room with me, please?" Dex made a small move, quickly checked. It seemed the big chill went unnaturally still. He'd made his fortune riding undercurrents, and this room was thick with them. She nodded, flicking a quick, hopefully reassuring glance at Dex, then at her boss, then her mom, before moving to the opening. She followed him out into the hall. The alien she'd dubbed 4 was still on the table, the feather quivering now and again as stray currents of air lifted it. Or she shivered from fear. The man directed her to the great room. Inside, Gini found the first man in fur standing in front of the big tree. In a kind of weird twist, it looked as if Spock stood on his shoulder, giving her his live long and prosper sign. He indicated the couch, probably as a power play, but whatever. She'd almost forgotten she still hadn't returned to her full size, but was reminded when she perched on the edge, sort of leaning against it to keep her feet on the floor. No question, the big couch and the dude looming over her made her feel extra short, even without the alien shrinking in the mix. Was this how her mom felt sitting in her wheelchair and getting steadily smaller? It was an uncomfortable thought, and she shifted uneasily. The man in fur stepped to one side of the tree and gestured behind him. "What is this?" Geni's carefully didn't look at 2 or 3 on the mantel. "A Christmas tree?" He heaved an impatient sigh. "It's covered in, you all seem to be very fond of aliens." One finger flicked an Enterprise ornament, boosting the sneer factor in his comment, as if there were something sinister about this fondness. Had the man in black seriously never been to an SF convention? Gini licked her lips. "The tree is kind of my mom's ode to NASA. She's been a fan since the first guy orbited the Earth. And my sister and her husband work for NASA." "And you? Where do you work?" This did not seem like a good time to admit writing about aliens. "I work for the other guy in the kitchen, Lincoln Graham. I'm his personal assistant." She didn't elaborate, didn't feel she needed to, since the big chill had won the point in their gaze clashing. He looked at her for what felt like a long time. With some panic, she felt a ball of heat form in her middle. Was it wrong to pray it was a hot flash? The heat spread out toward her extremities as the hard gaze drilled into hers. There was a plunk as one of the ornaments fell off the tree and rolled over to bump against the man in fur's booted foot. He looked down just as Gini felt another growth spurt. He looked up, then frowned slightly, as if he sensed a difference but didn't know what it was. She jumped up and bent to pick the ornament up. Chewie from Star Wars stared at her from a sea of silver gilt. She found a branch to hang it on and looked straight into the platter gaze of Dr. Five. Almost dropped it again, but managed to hook it over a branch despite shaking hands. Dr. Five winked. When eyes that big winked, it was impressive. Gini's lips twitched, even as her heart gave a frightened leap. She flexed her hands to get the shakes out, or at least better controlled. There was another gap where sleeves didn't quite hit where they were supposed to. She smoothed both arms down. She was almost back to her normal arm length. One more growth spurt ought to do it. Unless, what if her whole body wasn't growing the same? Be embarrassing if her parts weren't properly aligned, and possibly autopsy-inducing. That dried her throat. She swallowed, took a deep breath, and faced the man in fur. Your escaped prisoners must be uncommonly short. He frowned. What do you mean? You seem to be looking for them under my mom's ode to NASA Christmas tree? He hesitated, a hint of uncertainty in his steely gaze. That's quite the Christmas display on your roof. Gini felt her stomach drop. You think they are hiding in my mom's Christmas display? She bit back a snide remark about frisking Santa. It was always talking too much that gave the game away, and she had no clue what the display looked like. No. He paused again. Seems a bit much. Gini didn't blink, mostly because her eyes were too dry. My mom likes to go big or go home with all her holiday displays. She swallowed, managed to add lightly. You should see what she does for Halloween. He seemed to consider this. In the middle of nowhere? Gini managed a wry lip twist. She thinks the space station can see it. It's, well, her gift to whoever is up there. It helped that this was actually true. Her mom really did think she had a thing going with the space station. Or she'd been blowing smoke all these years when it was really her green men A flying saucer and a green Santa sitting in a red rider sled being pulled by a flock of pink lawn flamingos. It was her turn to blink. She nodded, half shrugged, gave him a "what can you do" look. But Gini felt a bunch of alien autopsies, and possibly some human ones, hanging in the balance. She leaned in as if confiding a secret. My mom thinks Spock works for NASA. She was hoping he'd come for Christmas this year. His eyes widened a bit. She nodded and grimaced. At least she doesn't get up there herself anymore. His gaze flicked up, widened, and he almost grinned. He stopped himself, but it almost happened. He suddenly became almost human, too. Right. He hesitated, and Gini had that sense he was getting orders from somewhere. We're sorry we disturbed your holiday preparations. We'll have some men on the road for a while until we catch the, escaped prisoners or get new intel on their movements. Well? Gini's smile felt more normal. If we find them in our presence, we'll give you a call. He didn't smile. Not that she expected him to. She felt better for it, though. Oh, she had a thought. My sister and her husband are probably heading this way. She looks like me. She got a look. We're twins, so we look alike, identical twins. She clamped her lips shut. Please let them through. My brother-in-law's kids are pretty ticked off that he's late. Though if you were to give Isaac a ride in a helicopter. He stepped back with some haste. Wish I could, but... He turned and booked it out of the room, like double time even. Out in the clearing there arose quite the clatter as the men in fur withdrew from the various parts of the house and exited from doors front and back and lined up for collection. And then there was a profound silence. Slowly, so slowly, it was almost slow motion. The branches of the tree parted and Dr. Five clambered out, giving a wince or two as the branches caught at his green skin. They thought your flying saucer was... She couldn't say it. He nodded solemnly. Slap Santa on it and they'll think it's a blow-up display, said a tiny voice behind her. That's what Isaac said, so we did. It was 4, her feathers still bobbing. Her skin seemed a somewhat lighter green, too. Well, okay then. Couldn't argue with what had worked. Now what? There was a choking sound from the doorway, and Gini saw something she thought she'd never see, not her lifetime or in the next life. The big chill rocked back on his heels with shock. After 10 novels, Gini felt she ought to be better at words, particularly since most of her books dealt with some kind of alien interaction. And now that she'd had real first contact, well, that almost made her an expert, or should have. She tried for a PA-type smile, but it wasn't easy. I did mention we had a kind of situation here. Had she had time to mention that? The big chill stared at her, blinked, stared some more, blinked some more. He looked back toward the hall as if he wanted to bring back the men in black, but Dex and Desi were there. Dex channeled his total cop stance, his hands at his waist, one of them very close to his handgun. She thought it interesting that her mom managed to look "don't do it" while sitting in a wheelchair. He turned back to face her but didn't manage to find his voice. Desi rolled past him and the aliens clustered around her chair, two of them taking one of her hands with obvious and tender affection. "Our mothership has contacted us," two, or possibly three said. "Its systems are functioning well once more." Four trotted up to Gini, and with an oddly formal solemnity, removed the feather from her hat and presented it to Gini. Gini smiled at her and took it, letting her hand close over Four's this time, giving the green hand a gentle squeeze. "Thank you. I don't—" Four shook her head, the green mouth turning up at the edges. "It is well." Desi nodded, and Gini could have sworn she faded some more, her body shrinking as she returned to her true age. She looked up and smiled at Gini, the eyes so very much her mom's that Gini caught her breath. Gini went to her, kneeling between two aliens and putting her hands on top of the green ones. The skin was cool and soft and, well, green, unsettling, but she owed it to her mom not to flinch. Gini met her gaze, finding some comfort in the fact that the vagueness was gone for now. There was something else in there, too. Gini's head tilted. "You're leaving?" Was her mom leaving? Or leaving? Desi freed one hand and reached out and smoothed Gini's hair back from her face. "You'll tell your sister goodbye, that I love you both very much." Her hand lingered. "I'm so proud of both my beautiful little daughters." "Mom," Desi shook her head. "We all have to go. I've been going for a long time. Dexter will watch out for you." Involuntarily, Ginny's gaze jerked up to meet the big chill. While still pale, he'd recovered enough to give her a wry look. He didn't look uncomfortable. He never did. But he distanced himself some. "I can only be put together for the workday," she admitted, as if he'd asked. She'd created, she realized now, a fictional PA to show up, a persona for the real Genie to hide behind. It was weird she'd only now figured it out. Oh, she was good at her job, but the polish, the crispness, so very much not her. The real her was the writer, the geek, the gal not afraid to don a Star Trek uniform with her geek friends. "This is the real—" She stopped. "Well, the cabin is real. This is my first nonfiction alien encounter, but the real me, even before this, was not, well, that calm." The big chill nodded slowly, and she bit back the impulse to ask again, why her? Now she'd probably never know. A pity that. Dr. Five put a green hand on her head. Kneeling, her gaze was even with his platter one. He might have smiled. "You have done well once you ceased to panic. You are indeed like your mother before you." The ball of warmth formed again, surging out, and she felt her last growth spurt happen. The big chill's eyes got wide again. She almost told him it wasn't her fault, but managed to, not to. Dr. Five leaned close. He won't remember. It was probably better if he didn't, but she hoped she wouldn't have to turn him down again. Wasn't easy to turn her back on the romance novel, billionaire proposal moment, even if she'd never really planned to say yes. Made her feel a bit dubious when she realized it. But she'd needed the proposal to come home, even before she knew Dex was here. Probably needed to add it to her list of character flaws she needed to work on. Dex stepped up to Desi's wheelchair, and he bent to plant a kiss on Desi's wrinkled cheek. "You're one of a kind, Desi. Thanks." Desi patted his cheek. She looked at Dr. Five. "Is it time?" He nodded. "You should both distance yourselves." Dex held out a hand and pulled her up. He didn't let go as they distanced themselves. There was a hum that started softly, then began to build until she felt it in her teeth. It wasn't exactly painful, but it wasn't comfortable either. "Mom!" She half reached out, then let her hand drop. "I love you. We both love you." There was a bright flash, and just for a moment, she thought she saw her mom young again. Not 8, but young and happy, and her eyes bright with excitement at the coming adventure. Dateline, notes from Isaac's strategic planning notebook. This Christmas vacation has turned out better than expected. Santa Claus, aliens, and the men in black. Dateline, from Daphne's cell phone, cookies. They made me make cookies? And aliens? Seriously? Dad so owes me for this one, though that Fed guy wasn't half bad. Dateline, advanced scouting party report. Closest near miss yet. But we are pleased our friend Desi travels home with us again.